Unlocking cyber knowledge one episode at a time. This is Gnosis by Smartcomply Academy.
Welcome back. It's the second episode of the ISO 27001 series, and in this episode, we are diving into the fundamentals of information security. If you have ever wondered what really keeps data safe and how organizations defend against cyber threats, then you should pay close attention. My name is Olusola Oyekola, and I remain your host for this ISO 27001 podcast series. Welcome back, Mr. Sheyi. We had an awesome session with you in the last episode. Are you ready for us today?
Yes, I am. Thank you for having me once again.
Thank you for joining us. Okay, so let's get right into it then. We often hear about the CIA triad in security, and you also touched on it on the last episode: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Can we dive deeper into this concept, into these principles? Can you explain to us what these principles mean and why they really matter?
Okay, so the principle behind information security is based on those three concepts: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And it's considered as the pillar for information security. And so looking at it from confidentiality, like I said in the last episode, that confidentiality speaks to allowing only authorized users or systems or applications to access specific information or sensitive information, as the case may be. So the reason why that is important, it's a way of ensuring that you're also protecting your information, that not everybody can have access to your information. And one of the reasons why you're doing that is you're trying to classify your data to ensure that specific data, because when we're using the word sensitive, it simply means that you first classified your data to be able to say, okay, this data is important, this data is not important, this data should be considered as confidential, this data should be considered as top secret or considered as sensitive. So each of those different information you will have to use. So the process of confidentiality is to be able to ensure that only authorized users can have access to those information, and that's what confidentiality speaks to. And even confidentiality is of different layers, when we look at it from the concept of data classification, from top secret, confidential, public information, so in specific organizations, specific countries, they call it security levels, will determine the kind of information you'll be able to have access to. So confidentiality is also in, different layers, as the case may be. So let's move to integrity. So for integrity,
can I just interject a bit? So when we talk about confidentiality, I think we will be looking at some areas like data classification, and but the most important part of this process is to actually have measures in place to ensure that we can protect and keep this data private.
Exactly.
So what are those measures? What are those controls that we can put in place to ensure the confidentiality of information?
Well, so some of the controls you can put in place is always access controls mechanisms. So the access control mechanism speaks to using things like username and passwords, and that speaks to you having to do something because something something you have, which has to do with implementing biometrics, using username, using PIN for password, what you know, and things like that. So you can also implement multi-factor authentication, whereby you had what you know and who you are, biometrics and other means of authentication into the process, just to ensure that is actually solidified.
I think that is also where the principle of least privilege comes in, where you are able to assign some specific people to access this sensitive data, and you are able to ensure that any other person within the system or within your organization is not able to access this information. I think that is also one of the implementations that organizations put in place to ensure that the data that they have within the organization are actually confidential. But when you look at all of this process, right, there are cases where you would have to make an exception. Maybe there is a particular person within the organization who needs to use this data, but have you been able to conduct your due diligence? Because then there are some certain situations, maybe let's say emergency situations, where you might need to grant this access to this set of people to probably play around in your database or something, and you're granting access to malicious insiders without even knowing it. And what do you think organizations can do, right, to ensure that this process is very rigid and they are able to also ensure that they protect and ensure the confidentiality of these informations, just like you had mentioned?
Yeah, so it if you look at it from the context of what you're speaking to, so it actually depends on the situation whereby you would want to grant external entities access to your information. You would have definitely would have done your due diligence, maybe do a background check on the person. That it depends on how sensitive that information is, to be able to determine if the person, the type of authorization the person should have when it comes to accessing those information. And when it comes to that, you would have to have, so there are different authorization levels. You can do a read-only access, you can create a write access, you can use some system engineering concepts to be able to design what type of access that user will be having, when it comes to having access to that information. So most times, if it's just depending on the role, the person you want, the entity you want to get access to, most times it's always good to do a read-only access, at least as the first layer. Yeah, so they only have access to the information that they're supposed to have access to. And then some people even use as an added layer of information to use file integrity check. So let's say, for example, somebody has a read-only access and the person is trying to pry into other folders, or is trying to make some changes. You can tend to see some of those changes that somebody is trying to make. Even though you block the authorization, you can see the person is trying to move into other areas that they don't have access to. You can see the logs that, okay, why we gave you access to view this folder, why are you trying to move into another folder? So in that case, you start to monitor the person's intent. Okay, what are you trying to do? So different. The core thing about when it comes to implementing access control is it also always take you back to the type of assets you're trying to manage, or the type of information you're trying to ensure that you're providing confidentiality to. So it requires you knowing that information, knowing the impact if that information is compromised, and then putting your access control in place to be able to ensure that those information there's no data breach, so to speak.
When you talk about read-only access, right?
Yes.
You also probably grant the access to rights. But what is the major difference between these two permissions? I mean, if I'm able to read the information, then I already have the data. I already have the confidential information. But I might not be able to change anything in your system, but then I have data that I need. I have this information of sensitive data. So how does it actually factor into the confidentiality of information? If I already have this data, then the data is already exposed. If I cannot read it, then I can make use of it.
So what organizations also do to be able to protect that? So like I said, they also always take you back to the type of information you're trying to ensure that users you're trying to protect. So sometimes what if organizations do is to ensure that the user that will be having access to that information will need to sign a non-disclosure agreement. So when you sign a non-disclosure agreement, it means that you're liable to be taken to court if, for example, if that information is being leaked and it's being traced back to you. That information was because you had read access information. So the non-disclosure agreement helps organizations to also protect themselves from a legal point of view. So once if they found a violation to that principle or a violation to that information, there's a data breach, and it was, after investigation was linked back to the fact that you had access to that information, then that would require some legal requirement or legal things to be done against such person. So those are also ways you can also protect yourself. But most times the most important thing is to sign a non-disclosure agreement and then grant the user access, and then still monitor the user, as that has been ongoing as well.
Thank you very much. Which means that there has to be protection measures in place on the side of the client and also on the side of the vendors.
Yeah,
that's very much enlightening. But cyber criminals are always finding new ways to attack your systems. And what are some common threats to confidentiality, and how can businesses defend against them?
Okay, so from research, one of the things when it comes to attack is always what we call the human error. And when it comes to human error, most successful attacks happen as a result of human error. Somebody clicking a link that is not supposed to
Mm,
click, or somebody sharing sensitive information, maybe with a friend, and then that information goes from that friend to another person, from another person to another person. So
mm,
one of the major thing is, let me capture everything, or in the word social engineering. So social engineering has to do with manipulating or trying to gain sensitive information by manipulating its targets. Let me use that word. So phishing, for example, you send a malicious email to someone to click a link. The person clicks a link. The person downloads the malware on the computer, and then that malware is being used to extract information or used to cause harm, such as ransomware attack. So, one of the key ways to protect organization is to pay more attention to user awareness program. And one of the
yeah.
things I've seen, yes, one of the things I've seen is that, well, it depending on, because it also costs budget, to come about with creating the content, hiring consultants to help you go through those specific modules. But organizations should also pay attention to it, because educating your users, we know that human are the weakest link. So
Yes.
educating your users to ensure that they understand the cyber threats, and to also prevent against them. Basic safeguarding rules. Don't share your password. Don't keep your password in a place that's easy to for easy view. Don't click on links that you're not aware of. Don't share company sensitive information. Don't share too many information about the organization. So all of those basic housekeeping rules also help the organization protect organizations from cyber attacks, as the case may be. So I will always recommend that organizations should really pay more attention to user awareness program,
Yeah.
phishing attacks, ensure that organization perform breach and phishing attack simulations, just to ensure that their users keeps getting educated, understanding the techniques by which attackers use to be able to exploit information using social engineering techniques. So it helps organizations to protect from a human point of view. While you also go ahead to implement specific controls, your email security, solution tech controls you can put in place, email security solutions that you can also use to detect and identify phishing links within emails, and then those solutions will be able to extract those URLs or block those URLs, as the case may be. So different controls can be used from a technological point of view, but from a human point of view, it's better you invest heavily on user awareness program as well.
Thank you very much. And I think that boils down to the three pillars of cybersecurity and compliance, which is people, process, and
The
technology. And that
technology,
is
yeah.
why on the secure application, we actually have a certain module that helps you pick up this activity when it comes to ensuring that you are able to equip these employees with the necessary skills, knowledge that is required for information security within your environment. And the Smartcomply Academy also provides a training module that is able to ensure that you are able to assign periodically these awareness training courses to the employees, just to ensure that they get familiar with security best practices. And I think from here, we are able to move on to the integrity aspect of it. So when it comes to integrity, just like you had mentioned previously, I took down some notes. You said it ensures that your data remains accurate and unaltered, right? So what mechanisms or what tools can organizations use to safeguard their data and the integrity of this data?
Okay, so when it comes to doing that, one of the key ways by doing that is to implement what we call hashing. So hashing ensures that your data remains the same. So let me give you a typical example. You create a Word document, and that Word document, you create a file, an hashing file to it. You create an hashing file that comes with an algorithm or an hash value. Yes, an hash value for that particular file, and then you make it public. So now, if somebody modifies that file or modifies that document, and then you compute the hash value again, that hash value will be different from the initial one. So what organizations do to maintain that their data has been modified is to use they leverage more of using hashing or checksum. So sometimes you go to some websites and you want to download a particular application, for example, and then you see that the checksum value for that particular application you're trying to download. And then
Yes.
if you download that application and then you try to run that checksum value again on the application you downloaded, if it matches with that on the website, then it means it hasn't been altered. But if you run a checksum again on that particular value, on that particular application, you see that that value or doesn't match with the previous one, the one on the website, then that means that application has been modified. But the truth is that not everybody's going to go through that process, because not
Yes.
everybody's enlightened on doing that. So that's where people download malware unknowingly, because they trick you into downloading an application that looks like the legitimate application. And then once you download this kind of application, it becomes it's a malware, and then it goes ahead to perform its intent on your PC or whatever appliance you use to download it. So from a control point of view, organizations also use tools to be able to detect if a particular application has a malware embedded in it. So once you download a particular application and that application has a malware, for example, because what Trojan horse means is you're downloading so to speak, a legitimate based application, but that application has been modified. It has been corrupted with specific type of code, so that once you download it, you then go ahead to perform its actual intent on your machine. Maybe it's to steal data or to turn your computer into a dummy, whereby it sends information to what we call command and control center, whereby the machine could be involved in other types of attacks. So those type of controls to be able to identify the integrity of that application that you're downloading, to say, oh, this application, even though it looks legitimate, it's a malware, and then it blocks that application from being installed. So different tools, different controls are put in place to be able to guide against the integrity of data and the information you're trying to also work against as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Enlightening. And I think that would bring us to the availability aspect of it now. And when it comes to the availability, you are able to ensure that your systems, your services, they are always available and without any disruption at any point in time. So how do you think that companies can achieve this? I know that you are able to have backups and you are able to have redundancy, but at least the only implementation that is required to ensure the availability of your service at every point in time.
Well, from that point of view, I would say those are the key controls you can put in place. Redundancy most especially. So you can implement redundancy in different ways. You can do redundancy using the concept we call failover, whereby you implement two devices, whereby one is receiving all of the information, and if that device fails from a device level, then those information will automatically be transferred to the second device. And then you can also do what we call clustering. So clustering means that you have multiple devices being logically considered as one. So what it means is that, let's say you have 4 different servers and they're being used as a web server, for example. So meaning that those 4 different servers will be processing traffic. But from the client point of view, they will see that information or see that server as just one, let me use the word logical server, but you would there are 4 different physical servers processing the same traffic. And so what that means is that if one of them fails, 3 of them are still available to receive the traffic or to receive the processing of your information. So backup is another way you can also do that as well, consistent backing up of your information, because most times when malware or ransomware attack plays a major attacks an organization, some of them don't have a backup. And if they have a backup, they don't test those backups frequently, because you might have a backup solution and you feel, okay, yes, we're doing our backups consistently, we're doing our incremental backup, we're doing our full backup. And then at the end of the day, when it's time to recover, you realize that those data were not properly backed up. So what some organizations do is that, periodically they run disaster recovery process, whereby they do check their backups, test their redundancy processes, check their backup, do some restore, and see how they respond to security incidents as well. So those are some of the ways you can also protect against integrity. And some also use concept called risk transference, where they have, especially from a cloud point of view, where they'll have to have an SLA agreement to say if our servers or goes down or is not available within a certain period of time, then you have to pay a fine. So different methods you can use different risk mitigation approach to be able to get that done. But you can't go wrong if you have your redundancy in place, your clustering in place, your backup in place, and all of those technologies and concepts in place. You can never go wrong. It's the most important thing is just to have multiple layers of controls. So in case one fails, you can always fall back to another, which is what we call compensating controls.
Yes. Thank you. And I think there is one word that stays in most conversations when we are talking about cybersecurity, when we are talking about information security. There is the vulnerability that comes up in every conversation. When we are talking about vulnerability, what does it mean exactly? And how do attackers exploit these vulnerabilities to breach systems?
Okay, so when it comes to vulnerability just simply means a loophole in the system in a very nutshell. So vulnerability, I know we've termed it more from a technical point of view, but vulnerabilities cuts across the three different bedrocks. I mean, from a people point of view, from an organization, from a technology point of view, from a process point of view. So vulnerability in a nutshell is having a loophole in the system, okay? Be it in an application, be it in the process, be it in the technology, be it in the people. Even ignorance can be considered as a vulnerability because it's a loophole. You don't understand how this thing works, so that is a vulnerability. So from an organization point of view, you have to attack vulnerabilities from those three different points of view. Firstly, from a people point of view, you're attacking it by ensuring that your people are properly educated, ensuring that they go through user awareness programs for them to be educated. And so imagine if a user is not educated, it clicks a phishing link, and that phishing link comes a malware to that, results in a ransomware attack, for example. That organization will have to pay billions of dollars if they want to go ahead to pay for that ransom, which is not always advisable. But if they might suffer a fine from regulatory bodies, because when they go through the investigation, they realize that you didn't conduct enough user awareness program. That is a loophole. Okay, that could be considered as a fine that could be used to fine that organization. So going back to the normal technical things that we pay attention to. So vulnerabilities, like I said, loophole within a system, an application, a process, or a technology. And how do attackers exploit those vulnerabilities? So they do that by first even identifying that there's a vulnerability within your system. So what they do is they're different. They do what we call reconnaissance. So reconnaissance is of two layers. We have passive reconnaissance, we have active reconnaissance. So from an active point of view means they're actually interacting with your system, running a scan on your web server, for example, or running a scan on your system to be able to identify vulnerabilities. And the concept of vulnerability management for organizations is for them to be able to proactively identify those vulnerabilities and mitigate them before the attacker does. Okay, so the way they do it, like I said, is they run scans, they identify those loopholes, and then they start trying to use a lot of exploiting techniques to be able to exploit those vulnerabilities. So if you don't have adequate control in place to be able to mitigate against those vulnerabilities that were identified, you don't run your patches as regular as possible. You don't ensure that you're using best practice in terms of implementation of some of your controls. You have default password, you're using default password on specific applications. You don't have some admin techniques implemented on some of your critical assets, then those vulnerability would definitely be exploited. They always say that there are two types of organization: those that have been hacked and those that would soon be hacked. Let me use that word. So vulnerability management is a critical thing that organizations should also pay attention to.
Thank you very much for that. And I think one word that actually sticks from your explanation and from what you have mentioned is exploits. You talked about exploits and about attackers exploiting these vulnerabilities within the systems, within the organization, and you kind of make it sound like vulnerabilities attract threats. What is the relationship between these two? What is the relationship between the vulnerability and the threats? How does it begin?
So it works hand in hand actually, because from a risk management point of view, risk is always likelihood of a threat materializing and also the vulnerability in place. Yes. So different types of vulnerability attract different types of threats. So let's use something very easy to understand. For example, Now you have a house, and that house definitely has a gate, and that gate doesn't have any lock attached to it. There are two types of the threat associated to that is definitely you've given easy access. Theft can easily happen because now somebody can come into the house, steal things, and walk out freely. So each vulnerabilities have different types of threat associated to different types of vulnerabilities. So vulnerability that has to do with, let's say for example, you're running an application that has a weak password. What type of threat would happen to that? It's theft of information, data leakages. What it means is that somebody can compromise your system and then go ahead with valuable information. So different vulnerabilities is associated with different types of threats. So that's why running security assessment is very, very, very important to be able to identify associated risk. And the core thing again is that in the whole of this vulnerability management, looking at it from a threat point of view, is asset management play a very critical role. You need to be able to understand your assets. What are the assets that I have within my organization? And once you've identified your assets, you have to be able to prioritize those assets. Which assets, if which asset is compromised, what impact would it have on our organization? And that's where risk actually comes into play, where you begin to look at this is a threat and what is the likelihood of this threat happening. Okay, but you can't do that if you don't understand your assets. So understanding your assets, doing a proper asset management, it's very, very critical when it comes to identifying vulnerabilities and knowing the associated threats applied to it. So another example, you have a data center in a country, in a specific location. One of the threats that might be prone to that location is maybe storm, for example, a physical type of or a natural disaster. Okay, now that threat might not apply to Nigeria, for example, because we hardly have such type of tornado attacks. You hardly have, but those things happen more in the United States and all of that. So the fact that you have an asset, you've identified the asset as a data center, but you now need to start looking at what are the associated threats based on location, based on different things like maybe technicalities. What are different things that could happen, to this type of asset that we have? So it's actually a very, very broader concept, but the most important thing is pay attention to your asset management and then look at the associated threats that is associated with those type of assets.
I think there is something that I would like to ask you. You talked about asset identification, and one thing came to mind, right? Just the way we identify our data, we are able to document them, and then we are able to classify this data. Does it mean that we have to do the same for the assets? We have to classify our assets based on their sensitivity.
Yes. So when it comes to assets, you need to first able to identify your assets. What are the assets that we have? And those assets doesn't have to only speak to just technical assets, or maybe your servers, your firewalls. Your data is also an asset. Intellectual property is also an asset. So you have to be able to document all of those assets. They call it. It's called configuration management database. Okay. They call it CMDB. So there's certain items you keep. They're called configuration items. So, and from an ITSM point of view, we have it from an ITSM point of view, from a cybersecurity point of view as well. But in its own sense, just to keep it very short, you need to be able to have a documentation for all of your assets. You keep a documentation of those assets. What's the name of the asset? What's the location of the asset? What are the data on that particular asset? What is the impact if that particular asset is being compromised? So sometimes some might say this is a very critical asset, or they might have an asset score, depending on the type of tool you're actually using though. You might call an asset score, you might call a critical asset score. Different vendors, solutions use different names, but the most important thing is just to help you classify that asset in such a way that if this asset is compromised, what impact would you have on your organization? So you need to have that documentation of all of your assets, and human beings are also part of the asset as well. So putting up health and safety resources in place, ensuring that you have communication channel in place, ensuring that there's a medical aid whatsoever and things are in place to protect your asset, human asset as well, is also there as well. So it's very critical for you to know all of your assets within your organization as well.
So the first step would be to identify the assets, right?
Yes.
And then you're able to run an assessment on these assets to try and identify what are those risks that are associated with these assets that you have in scope.
Exactly.
Right. And
Exactly.
we all know that risk management is at the heart of information security. Can you walk us through the key steps organizations take to identify, assess, and manage security risks within their environments?
Okay, so like I said, I think I've spoken a lot on when it comes to identifying assets. So different people use different approach. There are different asset management solutions out there that you can actually use to be able to identify your assets, and there are different technologies you can use to do that. So I won't want to go into specific vendor names on how to go about in those that, but they're very fantastic vendor solutions you can use to achieve your asset management. And then when it comes to assessing those assets, there are different ways you could do that, but it's always classified in two ways, because you assess your asset based on risk actually. Yes. And there are two different ways you can do that. We call it quantitative analysis, and then we do qualitative analysis. Now, the quantitative analysis speaks to quantity from a financial point of view, in the sense that we have servers, for example. You have a data center, you have different servers. So imagine if these servers goes down, a physical server, for example, that holds critical information for your organization. If this server is being compromised, or these servers suffer, maybe involved in fire incident, for example, what impact would it have on your organization? What is the financial loss that your organization is going to be involved in? What are they going to do from a financial point of view? What's the actual value? And there's some very formulas you can actually use to be able to get that. You have to look at things like annual loss expectancy, single loss expectancy, SLE, annual rate of occurrence, ARO, and then exposure factor. So you have to, so that those calculations, I don't want to go into those calculations, but those are the different ways you can actually go ahead to identify, to understand what are we going to lose if this kind of incident happens. Okay. And that's where the financial point, that's the qualitative point of it. There is another thing what we call quantitative. Okay, so the quantitative speaks to intangible. What are we going to lose from an intangible point of view, like things around customer trust, losing reputation. So imagine organizations that they've suffered data breaches, they lost maybe millions of customer data in the internet. Their customers will start having doubts that it means that my data is not protected, my data is not safe with you. So definitely they want to pivot to another type of customer and all that. So you tend to lose customers, lose client reputation and all of that. So this is where the quantitative or qualitative play comes into play. So you will have to use those two different measures to be able to analyze all of your assets and then come up with a value to say, okay, these are the critical assets, this is the value we're going to use. After you've been able to do that, the next thing you want to do is now to begin to implement controls. Okay, after you've identified your assets, you've identified the associated threats that might be targeting those assets, then you begin to put in controls. Different type of controls, like I said, will determine the type of critical assets. And when it comes to implementing controls, one of the reasons why going through the second phase of classifying your assets is because you then need to know how much you're going to invest on this type of critical assets. If you've done your risk assessment, you see that this asset, if it's compromised, we're going to lose $1 million, for example, from an organization. It would be advisable if you want to invest like $100,000 on a control to protect that type of asset. It will make a lot of sense because there's a lot of return on investment on that. But you can look at an asset that if it's compromised, it won't really cost you nothing. And then you want to do a $1 million control or a $100,000 control. So you want to do that. So one of the reasons why you have to go ahead to do your assessment first is for you to be able to classify your asset, know what impact would affect my asset if there's any form of compromise, so to speak, and then you can then invest appropriately on the type of controls you can put in place. So that whole concept also speaks to what we call risk risk treatment. Okay,
Yes.
so there are different ways you could treat it. After you've gone ahead to do your analysis, you could decide to say, okay, we want to avoid this type of risk. That's what risk avoidance is, the form of treatment. You can want to do what we call risk mitigation. It means you want to take responsibility and put in some controls in place to be able to mitigate against those such risk. We want to do what we call risk acceptance. I mean, okay, we've accepted it. We know that this is a risk, but there's nothing we can do about it. However, we'll try to see how we can reduce the impact of that risk. But we've accepted it as something that it's a major risk, but we've implemented controls, and then there's nothing we can really do about it. But we've accepted that risk. And then the last one is transference of risk, whereby you take that risk and then you make it somebody else's problem. That's what risk transference is. You make it take a risk and you make it somebody else's problem. So meaning that if
somebody
risk
else's responsibility.
Exactly. So if that risk materializes, then you're going to be held liable for that. So that's what risk transference. That's why we call it risk insurance. Type of thing. So these are risk treatment. Then after you've gone through that, the last phase is you then begin to monitor, because you just don't implement controls and then you leave it and say, okay, now I've implemented control, I can go to bed. No, you still have to consistently monitor it. Is this control is it properly, is it effective? Is it actually achieving the goal of the controls? Are we really, really optimizing the use of this, control? So those are the 4 different areas. And when it comes to risk management, there's what we call risk management frameworks. There are different methodologies you could use. So different organizations use different methodologies, adopt different, risk management frameworks, when it comes to handling their risk within the organization.
Okay, so you talked about the consistent monitoring of the controls that you have been able to put in place, right? And yeah. I'm wondering, do you mean that these controls, they are actually not foolproof, which is they could still expose some certain vulnerabilities when it comes to a particular period, or maybe due to how threats are imagined, how new threats are imagined, then it means that these controls that you have been able to put in place, you are able to review these controls and then you are able to update them to meet up with the new trends that are arising. That's in the cybersecurity space. So what exactly or how are organizations able to monitor these controls? Because when you talk about controls, they are usually third-party solutions and maybe some certain physical implementations or maybe some certain processes that you are able to put in place. But when it comes to the technical controls now, in which you are able to leverage on third-party solutions, you would expect that this third-party and vulnerabilities that arises, but then you're still charged with the responsibility of monitoring these controls. You need to review them and ensure that yes, these systems are actually updated. That kind of feels like a very difficult thing to do for an IT person, for example, right? Because if you have to monitor another person's solution just to ensure that you can keep up, then that is a very, very stressful thing to do. How do you think that organizations or the IT support team or our cybersecurity experts, how do you think that they can monitor these controls effectively to ensure that at any point in time, the effectiveness of these controls can be maintained?
Okay, so that's a very, very, very good and interesting question. So when it comes to monitoring your controls or monitoring the effectiveness of your controls, so the first thing that your control is helping you to do is to achieve visibility. Okay, it's to ensure that you have visibility into everything that particular control is doing, and that is where it's solutions that, like a SIEM, for example, plays a major role, because it allows you to be able to incorporate as many logs from different sources, and then you have one central dashboard to have visibility into it. So the first thing that your tool should be able to do is you should be able to ensure that this tool is still providing me with visibility. Can this tool still identify as many threats as possible, depending on the type of control that you put in place? Now, the type of control you're also putting in place also plays it also depends on how you monitor that type of control. It's not the same technique you use to monitor let's say, review a firewall, for example. It's not going to be the same thing you're going to use to review a email security appliance or a solution that try to monitor emails. So
Yes.
different technology or different controls has its own monitoring techniques, in place. But in general, I just want to speak a little bit of in general, so that at least it can speak to different types of control. The most important thing is that you also need to benchmark it against what the solution is meant to do. If a solution, for example, is meant to be able to detect threats, for example, you need to be able to consistently say this particular solution is still being able to detect the threats that we implemented this control for. If it's not detecting the threat, then you have to start looking at it. Okay, is it that did we implement it correctly? Or it's the solution not doing what it's meant to be doing, or do we need to upgrade the solution, or do we need to look for another tool that is doing far better than this tool that we've just implemented? So you have to look at it from each of those different angles. But the most important thing is that the reason why you implemented that control should still be achieved. Is this tool providing me with visibility? I mean, to be able to identify the risk that I'm using this particular tool to mitigate against. Is it properly optimized? Because sometimes most tools are not properly optimized, or they're not being used to its full scale. So imagine somebody purchased a firewall, for example, and one of the major things they're using the firewall to do is just to allow to do maybe nothing, for example, for the traffic from internet to go to the internet, and that's all they're using that device for. But that device could do many more things. You can use it for deep packet inspection, you can use it for access controls, you can use it for so many things depending on the feature of that tool. So another thing is, when it comes to monitoring, is to ensure that is this tool being effective? Are we using all the features that pertains to this tool? Because you might be using just a tool can provide you with 10 capabilities and you're only using one. Okay, so the other 9 capabilities that the tool provides, you're not making use of it. So you need to be able to ensure that the tool or the control you put in place is being effective, is thoroughly utilized, and then it's performing based on the requirements that you're actually using it for. So those are the other things you could actually look into. So it requires you, going deeper, looking at the controls itself, what it's meant to do, and is it achieving it? If it's not achieving it, you might start thinking, okay, maybe we need to get another tool or something to supplement it. If it's not providing us with the value that we're paying for that. So those are other things you might have to look into. But the concept of it is that different controls, the way you monitor different controls is different. But you can't, what I just provide is just like a general overview. But now, if you now start going into that specific controls, you now start looking at it, in nitty-gritty of that specific controls, and looking at it from how do we ensure that this particular control is properly, utilize it, doing what we're expecting it to do, and all of that. So unless you want me to go into specific controls.
No, I was actually just looking at the aspect of managing dependencies. Okay. And you would know that, you're actually meant to maintain some certain level of communication with your third-party service providers, where you are able to review the level of service at every point in time, and also ensure that, yes, they are ensuring that they provide the services that you have in your SLA and all. But what I am actually looking at, or the angle that I'm looking at this from, is a situation whereby an organization probably have invested in some threat intelligence tool, and they are able to identify threats, threats, vulnerabilities, and they are able to also kind of relate these to their infrastructure. Does this affect our infrastructure? Does this affect our services, our systems? And what about the tools that we have? Are they able to mitigate these emerging threats and vulnerabilities? How do we ensure that these threats do not materialize in our own environment? Now, I think that is where the communication comes in with the third-party service providers, because you need to go to them to tell them that, can your system do this? Can your solution help us with this? And all. But, the systems for the third-party service providers as well, they're actually limited, but then they get updated, right? We are very much aware of that. They get updated, but they are limited. There is what they have been designed to do.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So in this situation, what are organizations expected to do? Are they expected to wait for the updates? Because then, the third-party service providers, they are able to tell you, we are working on an update for this, but as an organization, are you able to decide to wait on the update from your third-party solution, or would you be expected to go and acquire another solution at that point because you cannot leave it to chances?
Yeah, so what that means is, so there's a concept called defense in depth concept, and what that means is you have multiple defense or multiple controls in place to protect your, we call it crown jewel, things that are important to your organization. So every organization should have defense in depth concept implemented within the organization. So meaning that you'd have multiple layers, multiple controls in place, compensation controls, as the case may be, just to ensure that if one control is compromised, then another control is also there to, to compensate for that particular compromised control, as the case may be. So and most of these things, they're very easy concept to describe, but another thing is that resources also play a major role in some of these things, because if you say that you have a control and maybe you've invested specifically on a particular control, threat intelligence, for example, and that threat intelligence cannot provide you with the adequate security that you're paying for, or the service you're paying for. So what it means is you have to cough out another set of money to implement as a compensating control. So what if you don't have that money?
Exactly.
So in as much as we talk about all of these security concepts, they are nice to have, but you also have to face reality of what organizations are facing. You can't tell me that I need to implement 10 firewalls. What if I only have money for one? What am I going to do about it? So we need to, in as much as we're talking about, this concept is nice, you need to have this, you need to have that, you also need to look at it from a customer point of view. Do they have the resources to be able to implement this type of control? So those are some of the limitations and those are some of the reasons why organizations also suffer attacks sometimes, because some of them might not be able to afford implementing multiple defense in-depth concepts, multiple controls, as the case may be. So they will have to leverage on what they have to be able to, and that in itself, it's a threat, because now if you have a control that is not sufficient enough to be able to mitigate against specific type of threat, then that's a risk to your organization. And that now takes you back to the top management and say, guys, we need additional fund. And when it comes to fund for IT, some of the board and don't really take it seriously, because they feel you IT guys just want to collect money for implementing controls. But now that boards are getting more aware of cybersecurity attacks, they begin to pay more attention and they get specific type of funds, to be able to fund their defense mechanisms, cybersecurity program, as the case may be. So in as much as we are looking at it from that point of view, we also need to consider the organization. So going back to your question in terms of resources, in that scenario, you need to have a compensating control. You can't just say you leave your gates open, waiting for them to update. What if it takes 1 year to update the solution to be able to identify the risk? What happens to your business, before then? So definitely you have to invest in compensating control. So that's where I'm bringing the concept of defense in depth into play. So you should have, circumventing control, compensating control. In case one control is not, providing you the adequate resource, then you can go ahead and do that. So it now boils to understanding the control, looking at other means, adding techniques. You can go ahead to. It's not all the time you have to implement technologies. To be honest with you, sometimes you have to use the existing technology you have, look at existing features, and then implement some of those controls that you have. So it's not all the time you have to keep investing in new technologies, So those are some of the things, organizations also have to look at. What can we do without even spending money? We've invested thousands of dollars in this control. What can we do? And that's also where, educating your technical staff is also important. Sending them on trainings, ensuring that they are aware of the latest technologies, ensuring that they are aware with mitigating controls. How do you use this particular technology better? What are the latest trends? What are the latest technology that are in place? And how can we use this technology to further protect our organization? So those are all of the other things that, organizations should also, pay attention to as well.
Okay, I think while we were talking about this, another thing came to mind. And what came to mind is that when we have all of these compensating controls, which means that we have multiple solutions that we have been able to implement, what about the management and monitoring of this solution? It can be a very tedious process when you have to go from one application to another application and all. And do you think that it would be advisable to have like a centrally managed or a comprehensive solution that kind of help you manage all of these activities at once?
Yes, it is. It is very, very, very important, and that's where centralized monitoring solutions plays a major role. So most organizations or most vendors now, they understand the fact that the solution I'm creating is not like my customer doesn't have any other existing control in place. So most technologies pay attention to integration, but to be able to integrate existing controls into their new solution, so that you can have an holistic or a centralized point, whereby you can have visibility to all of your threads and visibility to some of your controls, or monitoring some of your controls in place. Yeah, so you can't take away having that centralized monitoring solution or monitoring system that allows you to have visibility, at least even if it's 70%. And that's where it seems, plays a major role. The organization investing in maybe a case management solution that allows you to be able to have visibility into all of your threats, and having ensuring that you have them in one single location. So you can never take that, because it's very cumbersome. Imagine you have to log in into different solutions to be able to start looking at different logs, whereby you can incorporate them into one
Yeah.
different essential solution, where your SIM plays a major role, or your orchestration allows you to be able to automate that process, whereby all of them is in one place, and then it helps you to even easily respond to security incidents, because now it's one place. You don't have to go to solution A, solution B, and then looking for logs here and there. You have it in one
Yes.
central location, and then you can go ahead, implement automation as well, to be able to you're using playbooks to be able to respond to specific type of security incidents as well.
We have talked about the identification of assets. We have also talked about the security of these assets.
Yeah.
But can we also talk about how organizations can prioritize these assets? I think I also made mention of the classification of assets, and how you are able to ensure that all of your sensitive assets that you have, they are properly secured at every point in time. But how do you think that they can prioritize all of these assets that they have in scope?
Okay, so prioritization, so when it comes to prioritization, like I said, you first need to understand, you need to be able to classify your assets. Once you've been able to determine what impact, if this particular asset is being compromised, and then you will be able to say, if this asset is compromised, what impact would it have on the organization? So having gone through your assessment analysis place, you've been able to come up with what we call critical assets. Okay, so you've been able to classify them as a critical asset. So in that case, you then need to start paying attention to the vulnerabilities on those particular assets, and then you need to start prioritizing that. So most vulnerability management solution allows you to be able to automatically identify these vulnerabilities, and then helps you to automate the prioritization of those vulnerabilities. Okay, because vulnerability is very, very, it's broad. Yeah, it's always cumbersome. You have thousands of vulnerabilities to deal with, but once you've been able to identify your critical assets, you'll be able to prioritize those assets. And when you're prioritizing the asset, there are also different criteria you have to put in place. The first thing is what we call exploitability. Is this asset or is this vulnerability exploitable? If it's exploitable, what impact will it have on our organization? So it's not about just saying, oh, we have these are our critical assets, and then we need to remediate all of the vulnerabilities on those assets. No, you can't do that. And even from research, it says that most exploitable vulnerabilities are just 2% of the identified vulnerabilities. Okay, so you just have to be able to narrow down to those 2% of those vulnerabilities, those exploitable vulnerabilities that you can also mitigate. And when it comes to mitigating those vulnerabilities, and that's where when it comes to vulnerability management, you need to be able to do what we call tool selection. That point is a very, very critical point in vulnerability management, because the type of tool you use would also determine how effective your vulnerability management process would be. If, for example, you use a tool that can allow you to do proper prioritization using specific prioritization techniques, it's going to become a problem. Because now, how do you prioritize those vulnerabilities? How do you remediate? How do you know which one we should pay attention to, which one we shouldn't pay attention to? And then you also have to look at the skill level of the people that's going to remediate those vulnerabilities. Okay, there's some vulnerabilities might be very difficult to fix, and some might be quite very easy. A simple patch will go ahead to do it. But some vulnerabilities require to do some, some configuration modification to be able to do that. And the guys that's supposed to fix that need to know about that. They need to have that technical knowledge to be able to fix those type of vulnerabilities. So it all goes back to investing in your people, ensuring that they're very much aware of that the technical progress keeps getting better. by allocating funds for training to ensure that they're trained on an annual basis, they're getting equipped to be able to identify and mitigate some of these vulnerabilities effectively. So they're all into one another, one way or the other,
Yes.
things like that. So but that would be my own recommendation to organizations on how to go about doing such.
Thank you very much. And we have also talked about the fact that threats evolve, and the need for organizations to also adapt to these evolving threats. So I think one thing that I would appreciate if you can also dive deeper into is how organizations, or what are some of the best practices for staying ahead in the ever-changing world of cybersecurity or information security, as the case may be.
Yeah, the first thing is knowledge, information. You need to be aware of what's going on. Because the truth about it is that, and that's where having a robust, and that's why cybersecurity, community is very robust. There are a lot of organizations coming up with news on different type of attacks, and the truth is that those information could also be very overwhelming, because today you hear about this attack, tomorrow you hear about that attack. If you're not careful, it might put you in a panic mode, So the thing about it is that depending on your type of organization, type of industry that you service, it's good to align with regulation, align with information community that provide information as regards that. Okay, so if, for example, I'm in the medical line, you need to start paying attention to news that speaks to cyber attacks that attacks medical organizations, for example, so that you will look internally at your controls and say, okay, you know what, this attack just happened to hospital ABC. We are hospital DWY. How do we ensure that this vulnerability that was being exploited at hospital ABC, we've been able to mitigate in our own side? So the first thing to do is to ensure that you're conversant with information, subscribe to cybersecurity community that actually speaks to your industry, because the information is very overwhelming. I must be honest with you. There are a lot of information overload coming out here and there, and if you're not careful, you get into panic mode. Hey, I heard this happened today. Hey, you put a lot of this burden on your technical guys. Do we have this problem here? So you just have to stick to your own domain, so that you can use that to be able to control the information and then control how you mitigate against such risk that is happening out there. And all that. So that's why most organizations now are involved in providing information, blogs, just to help organizations know what's going on as we get cybersecurity threats.
Wow, what an awesome session. Thank you very much. We appreciate you. And if you have any questions, please, you can ask in the comment section, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And you are also able to visit the Smartcomply Academy platform to explore more knowledge. And this is where we bring it to a close for today. And you are also able to log in at academy.smartcomply.com to choose a course that interests you, and you are able to get certified to that as well. Thank you very much, Mr. Sheyi. We are very, 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 very happy to have you taking us through all of these provisions of the ISO 27001. This is Gnosis by Smartcomply Academy, unlocking cyber knowledge one episode at a time. I remain your host, Olusola. See you in the next episode, and bye for now.